Welcome, welcome, welcome to today's ATSG educational webinar, Citrix and Azure, Demystifying the Citrix and Microsoft Roadmap for Desktop as a Service. So we're going to talk about server stuff too today. My name is Neil Rosenberg. I lead the Microsoft practice here at ATSG, which includes Citrix, and I've been doing a lot of these events for many, many years, and I see some familiar faces in the attendee list. So hello to everyone and looking forward to follow-up discussions. So we're going to have three major sections of today's webinar. First, we're going to talk about what is Azure and why should we care. We're then going to drill down into specific use cases and scenarios where Azure may be of benefit to your organization. And then what is Citrix Cloud? And we'll talk about some of the changes and new things going on with Citrix and how they may be pertinent to you. So, who is ATSG and why might you care? ATSG has been delivering IT services for over 2 decades, a little over 25 years at this point. We are a managed service provider, or more specifically a tech-enabled managed service provider, and an IT solutions provider, working very closely with Microsoft, Cisco, Citrix, and our other partners to deliver IT services to businesses throughout the United States of all sizes and across all industries. We do that across 3 major silos of technology solutions, and we've been doing that for clients for a very long time, building long-term relationships. Our 3 core silos are what we refer to as Ready Tech, which is project-based services and projects as a service, typically across Windows endpoints, productivity and collaboration, which is largely Office 365, and supporting technologies and enterprise networking, as well as cloud and data center technologies, which falls under our Ready Cloud silo. That includes both our private Ready Cloud, private cloud service, as well as Azure and other hybrid cloud solutions and data center services. And then we also provide a wide range of managed services under our Ready Manage banner, both Tier 1 end user service desk and Tier 2 operations management and monitoring services, as well as application management services around things like SCCM, Azure, Office 365, SharePoint, to help IT organizations that want assistance in specific technologies. All of that is underpinned by our AI squared intelligent IT platform, which we use to deliver services to our customers and integrate with our customers' IT organizations. So, part 1 of today's session, what is Azure and why should I care? We have seen a history major from my college days, and history does tend to go through cycles. So we've seen a number of cycles in our industry over the years. In the 70s and 80s, it was the era of centralized computing. Mainframes inherently forced that by the nature of the technology. As we moved into the 90s, we moved into an era of decentralized computing, client-server. We had personal computers. We could do all sorts of interesting things with them. And complexity dispersed from the centralized mainframes and servers to the decentralized endpoints, unless you were a Citrix WinFrame shop at that point, in which case you had the benefits of a graphical user interface, but still centralized computing. We then dealt with that in the evolution to ubiquitous connectivity and the era of the web and internet. And we created centralized computing through websites and web-based applications. So we the pendulum swung a little bit backward the other way. And now we're in the cloud era, and I would argue actually moving into the 5th era of digital transformation, but that's all separate discussion. And in today's cloud era, we're well into that phase and that transition. So it really comes down not so much to cloud or not to cloud, as much as where do you leverage the cloud, how do you do so, how much, and when and at what speed. So as it relates to cloud, there are a number of benefits that drive organizations to utilize the cloud. Speed of deployment and adoption is one of them. Scale and cost efficiencies are another, the ability to scale up or down dynamically and take advantage of cost structures. Many of you in the audience are used to in economics and scale in your data centers of adding an individual server or blade to your environment as a unit of server-based computing. In Microsoft's Azure Cloud, the smallest unit of expansion is the size of a tractor trailer. Microsoft essentially wheels it in, plugs it into power and cooling, and you have presumably thousands of blades of processing power turned on at once. That's their smallest unit. So the economics and scale of that is pretty amazing and is leveraged to your benefit. It was Plato who said that wisdom begins with the definition of terms. So I want to define a couple of terms, and I think this will really emphasize why services like Azure and Azure specifically are beneficial to organizations. And also, what are the two key elements of Azure in terms of service delivery? So in a traditional non-cloud world where IT organizations built up services from the ground up, IT professionals would need to, deep breath for dramatic emphasis, configure the networking, configure the storage, configure the servers, configure the virtualization, configure the operating systems, configure the middleware, configure the runtimes, configure the data, and then set up the applications. It's a lot of work to get to the things that really deliver value to an organization, which is the applications and the data. That's where the cloud really accelerates that curve and reduces the effort for internal IT organizations to have to manage infrastructure. So we have three types of cloud services we're going to talk about. All the way on the right is an opposite extreme is software as a service, or SaaS. Examples of that would be something like Office 365 from Microsoft, or Salesforce, or Dropbox, Workday, Concur. These are all applications that have been built in a multi-user, multi-tenant model to take advantage of and leverage shared infrastructure. Nothing has to be built. The application is just there, just needs to be configured and filled up with data, and it's ready to use. And they're typically billed based on either usage or based on a user count. And you can be up and running with a credit card in a matter of minutes with many of these applications. It's a completely different ballgame from the traditional on-premise approach, even when you have benefits like virtualization behind you. The other two areas are where Azure plays, and that would be infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. The one that's probably easiest to conceptualize is infrastructure as a service because it utilizes virtual machines just like traditional on-premise, except that instead of having a hypervisor, a server stack, storage, and networking underneath, you have a cloud service underneath, Azure or other competitive services. So the customer responsibility in that situation manages the virtual machine from the operating system up. The platform from the hypervisor level down is managed by the vendor, in this case, Microsoft. Platform as a service, or PaaS, is the other side of Azure, and many Azure services are delivered this way. Essentially, everything in that stack is delivered, built, and managed by Microsoft other than the applications and the data. So when I talk to customers, one of the key things that I try to understand is to what degree does a customer have custom applications that they have built themselves using Microsoft tools like Visual Studio.net, because in those situations, those applications can be recompiled into web applications that instead of running on a web server, just run on Azure, serverless. And instead of pointing to a SQL server, they can point to SQL Azure, serverless. So there's a lot less to maintain, and you have the benefit of essentially infinite scalability. So this can be web applications, mobile applications, but in this case, the business, you folks, have to actually create or purchase the applications and populate the data. So Azure really works in those two middle stacks in terms of a workload. And this slide shows, it's a bit of an eye chart, but it kind of shows all the different things, and this is a few years old actually, so it's not even complete, in terms of all the different areas that Azure delivers services in, ranging from security technologies like multi-factor authentication and Azure Active Directory, to core compute services, to things like backup and disaster recovery, to leading edge services like big data or analytics and Internet of Things. And this is not dissimilar to Windows Server. If you think about what is Windows Server, for some people it's a file server, for some it's an application server or an RDS server. It can hold Active Directory. It has a lot of different roles. Well, Azure is like that, but a cloud service. And so you have to pick what are the things you need it for and how it'll help you achieve your objectives. And it's constantly changing, so it's important to have a culture of constant learning in working with cloud services like Azure. Azure also is an extremely highly trusted platform that meets all the major regulatory compliance standards and security standards. Microsoft is constantly enhancing this, and a lot of government workloads and workloads for sensitive industries like healthcare are being run in Azure based on the high security bar that Microsoft sets in operating the Azure service. That being said, the Microsoft is providing for security of the platform itself. Organizations that put data and virtual machines in Azure still have to secure the virtual machines and the application workloads from that point up. That's part of why that last chart is so important. But trust and control is very important to Microsoft. There are security centers and compliance centers, websites that have information from an educational perspective for you to address questions and concerns you may have prior to purchase of the services. And you need to look at security across multiple layers, from the physical security that's part of Azure's data centers to the infrastructure security that Microsoft applies in managing the environments, the networking that's built into Azure, but also which you can control, and the VM and app level security, which is largely going to be your responsibility. There's multiple levels to this. There's a lot of resources to tap into and tools like the Azure Security Center that you can use to analyze your own security as well as regulatory compliance in the Azure environment, just as you can in an Office 365 environment. And over time, Microsoft continues to integrate the tools around these technologies. So there's a lot of power here. Some of you may have heard of something called Azure Stack. Azure Stack is a technology that's still kind of working its way to prime time. It is fully functional. It's really a matter of people understanding what it is and finding the right use cases for it. In this case, we have the Azure Public Cloud, so a cloud environment where we allow you to run your virtual machines with appropriate security and segmentation of your stuff from everyone else's, but it's a shared platform. It's not a private cloud, it's a public cloud platform. However, some organizations want to be able to take Azure, write applications to run in Azure, but use them under their own control. And there are a couple scenarios where this can be pertinent. Azure Stack is not going to be the next wave of virtualization with the same level of cost effectiveness as a Hyper-V or a VMware type solution. It's much more powerful, and that isn't the design goal. The design goal for Azure Stack is to have common code, a common platform. So if you build an application to run in Azure, you can run it in Azure Stack, but it's going to run in your data center or a data center of a colocation provider or a managed service provider like us, where we are, you or we, are essentially running your own instance of Azure, where you have responsibility of managing the hardware platform, but you have control over the entire stack other than the Azure code itself, which is locked by Microsoft, and the hardware is very prescriptive in its configuration. There are two scenarios that I can think of where this is particularly pertinent, although this will change over time. One of them is situations of disconnected or intermittent connectivity. Think of a cruise ship or an airplane, or think of maybe manufacturing operation in an area that has sporadic internet connectivity. where you want to be able to run an application, but you may not have the connectivity to consistently do so over the internet. Well, you can run your own Azure and synchronize data when you connect. Another scenario is data governance. Some situations where perhaps a country requires you to keep data relative to that country within their geographical boundaries. So for example, you might have a location in Germany, you want to run a consistent application across your whole organization, but the German data and the German processing needs to stay within a private or third-party German data center. You could use Azure Stack to keep the German stuff in Germany. Not to pick on the Germans, but they're very particular about this particular topic. So Azure Stack allows you to essentially run your own instance of Azure on your own hardware, although the hardware is very prescriptive in very specific configurations and only from certain vendors. What may surprise people is how broadly Azure supports open source and third-party technologies. And Microsoft has been partnering with a wide range of vendors, from big folks like Oracle and SAP and Linux and Red Hat to a lot of smaller folks that utilize open source to deliver services to their customers. So there's tremendous amount of open source running on Azure, and Microsoft is very broadly supporting open source technologies. Part of how they're doing that is through the Azure Marketplace. The Azure Marketplace is a website where you can essentially turn up virtual machines or services that have been put into the marketplace for either purchase or trial, so that you don't have to essentially build out new solutions from scratch in Azure. So for example, since this is a joint event with Citrix, if you're running Citrix NetScalers in your data center, probably shouldn't call it NetScaler now, we'll get to that, and you want to run one in Azure for consistency and global service load balancing, you can just go to the Azure Marketplace and choose the NetScaler virtual appliance and spin it up, and you now have a Citrix application delivery controller sitting in the Azure Cloud that can be integrated with the ones you have on premise. Similarly, NetApp is a favorite vendor of mine. They have a virtual appliance that you can use to essentially turn Azure storage into a big NetApp SAN and replicate data via SnapMirror from your on-premise environment to Azure to the extent that technology is pertinent to you. And you can go on, different firewall platforms and routing and platforms and other types of applications. So that probably over 5,000 solutions now in the Azure Marketplace. A lot of people look to Gartner for guidance on who's best of class and leading the pack from the Magic Quadrant perspective. Slide is a little bit old, and I'm pretty sure that if I went to the most current content, we'd have a similar placement. It's really Microsoft and Amazon primarily fighting for the 1-2 spots in terms of the public cloud environment, and that's both from the perspective of innovation and capability, where Microsoft tends to really differentiate. And aside from any biases I have, if I were to say one thing that would sway me to Microsoft over Amazon, it's really the integration across the different platforms and the speed of innovation that Microsoft is operating at. Amazon was in the space first. They have a large installed base, and they do good stuff, but Microsoft is moving very fast. They're just as good as Amazon, and they have integration across a broader range of services and capabilities. So let's talk a little bit about Azure IaaS. I painted the picture of what PaaS is, and we'll come back to that, but Azure Infrastructure as a Service consists of three major areas of essentially capability. There's compute, or CPU, there's storage, and there's networking. We're going to talk about each of these individually. And as you put these all together, you have to manage them. So the way things work in Azure is if you spin up a new virtual machine in Azure, you would need to pick a virtual machine class like A2 or D2, V2. They have different classifications of VMs that have a different amount of CPU, memory, and disk space. You can then attach additional disk storage to those virtual machines. And it's a bit of an eye chart for all the different types of virtual machines. You need to understand a little bit what each is intended for. Some of them are graphics optimized, some of them are compute optimized, some of them are storage optimized, and so on. There's also optimizations for heavy-duty applications like SAP. And so if you migrate a virtual machine to Azure, Azure will make a best guess as to what type of VM it should be, but you should always check that and make sure it's optimized for the workload. And you can always change that, and it just changes the resources available to the VM as well as what you're paying to run the VM. Within Azure, there are different levels of availability. The SLA is 99.9% or 3 nines for just a single virtual machine. You can also set up what are called availability sets, and there's a little bit of a cost upcharge for that, but your SLA goes up. That's essentially protecting you against rack failure so that you have 2 versions of a VM running in 2 different racks within a data center. You also have availability zones where your data is replicated out of a data center to protect you from failure of that data center, or regional disaster recovery where you can replicate your data, say, from the US East Coast to the US West Coast or Central United States, so that you're protected from regional disaster. There are slight cost upticks associated with these availability options, but I would strongly recommend them in most cases. There are also a number of different ways that storage can be consumed. You can set up persistent disks, kind of like a virtual machine today, where you have a C drive, a D drive, an E drive, and you can mix types of disks that are assigned to those virtual machines. You can also put files into Azure, file shares. This can be for applications to talk to a file share, or there's a new technology called Azure File Sync, which is still developing, but as it evolves, will become essentially like a Windows file server in the cloud. Right now, it is essentially a Windows file server in the cloud that can replicate files down to on-premise servers. However, it's not fully integrated with Active Directory file system rights. That's in progress and will be here before too long. Azure also supports blob storage, and there are different ways of managing that, including import-export. Bear in mind that there are egress charges in Azure, as there are in all the public cloud platforms, other than for restores. So, one could argue that once you put data into a cloud, it's hard to get it out of it. That's probably true. So you do want to be thoughtful in how you approach things and how you set strategy in that regard. As I mentioned, there are different types of disks. When Azure first came out, it was standard SATA disk, but we now have solid state, both standard and premium, as well as ultra solid state for super high performance. So you can select these different types of disks when you spin up a virtual machine and choose the storage you want to attach to it. And there are different types of connectivity. Most of our customers start off with site-to-site VPN between their network and the Azure Cloud. However, there's also ways of configuring specific networking between Azure instances to basically set up security zones within Azure. You can have individual to site VPN networking. And for situations where you have larger amounts of data, larger numbers of servers, or require a higher performance metric, you can implement what's called ExpressRoute, which is a private connection between Azure and either your data center or your MPLS network. So ExpressRoute is not actually something you buy from Microsoft. It's something you buy from either your data center provider or your telecom carrier as a high-speed connection from your network to Microsoft's. There are a number of different networking services built into Azure. There's a built-in load balancer. There's traffic management for content delivery networking so that people in Australia hit the Australia site instead of going across the pond to Singapore or to the United States. You have firewall capability built into Azure. But if you don't like what Microsoft gives you and you want to replace it with your favorite third-party solution, the odds are pretty good at this point that those third parties are part of the Azure marketplace. And you can, for example, if you're a Barracuda firewall shop, you can put up a Barracuda appliance to act as your firewall in Azure for consistency of management. And so there are a range of services built into Azure, not unlike Windows Server, to deal with the entire life cycle of management of applications. And some of those tools can even be used for management of on-premise as well as cloud-based virtual machines. So for example, you can do update management of Windows and of Linux servers, either within Azure or on-premise from Azure as a management platform. So there's a lot of capability here to explore. So let's talk a little bit about the use cases for Azure. What are the situations where it would be deployed in, and where do people typically start? One piece of low-hanging fruit would be test dev scenarios. Many organizations have custom applications or third-party applications they've bought that you kind of roll the dice on when you apply patches or do updates, because it's just too expensive and time-consuming to have a fallback position. Conversely, that's something that the cloud is optimized for. The ability to set up a development environment that mimics production and apply changes or patches or code revisions into that environment, test with it, and then shut it down when you're done, so you're only paying for the compute you're using, is very compelling. And by the way, you don't have to invest in 2 or 3 parallel times the amount of hardware to run those things, which was the traditional reason most people don't do a great job at that. In addition, storage. Azure Backup can either be used on its own. It leverages code from System Center Data Protection Manager, or many of the major third-party backup applications like a Commvault or a NetBackup, Backup Exec, so on, can point to Azure to do disk to cloud instead of disk to disk tape. So you get the benefits of automated offsite storage. You do have to manage your storage costs, because things will rack up quickly, especially if you keep historical copies in multiple instances. However, storage is actually the cheapest thing in Azure. So you don't have to worry as much there. And we're seeing a lot of adoption of cloud-based backup, and we're going to talk specifically about disaster recovery on that. Infrastructure as a service virtualization. A lot of organizations start with specific point scenarios to start putting virtual machines in the cloud. For example, Active Directory, putting a domain controller in the cloud, just to have Active Directory in another location besides your offices, and have that be close to Azure AD for integration with Office 365. Sometimes when we do an Office 365 migration, we'll set up a domain controller, the Azure AD Connect server, and perhaps an Exchange Hybrid server in Azure as a way of getting the customer some experience with Azure without adding to the on-premise server workload. And by the way, it's a great first step toward disaster recovery with Azure, or a full migration of on-premise workloads to Azure. Conversely, you might have custom applications, web apps, SQL databases, that instead of migrating them to Azure, it makes sense to re-platform them. Maybe you can reduce costs, improve scalability, improve management. And that's one of the big decision points as you look in an environment is, do you move it as is and re-platform it later, or do you lift and shift doing that, or do you make the transformation as part of it? There's also a lot of other services within Azure. Artificial intelligence and machine learning is being used in a number of different industries to change the way service is delivered and speed up outcomes, whether it's healthcare or legal discovery. We have the Internet of Things, where intelligent endpoints are collecting data and putting it into Azure for analysis as big data by business intelligence tools. And Azure is constantly changing. If not every week, certainly every month, there's new features being added, there's new refinements occurring. So change management becomes an important part of this picture. And we also have Azure Active Directory and the Enterprise Mobility Suite, which we'll get to in a moment. So those are all good starting points or potential use cases as it relates to Azure. I want to talk specifically about Azure Site Recovery, because this is a great technology for disaster recovery, and a lot of businesses are challenged in this area because the old approach to DR was to basically take your production environment and duplicate it somewhere else. And that becomes, expensive to do, and it becomes difficult and time-consuming to maintain and manage and keep things up to date. Microsoft has built this solution out to protect virtual machines of both Hyper-V and VMware. And I know from experience, it actually also works with Citrix XenServer, as well as physical servers, where those systems can be replicated into Azure, and you can actually fail over and run the systems in Azure in the event of an actual disaster. It's very cost effective as a DR solution, and we're seeing a lot of traction in the market to use this technology. And we also offer this as a managed service where customers just want to outsource the entire disaster recovery management to us. As it relates to Azure, you can't talk about Azure without talking about Azure Active Directory and Active Directory. And this is an area where there does tend to be a bit of confusion. Many of you, if not all of you, have an on-premise environment with Windows Server Active Directory, and that is the identity management control plane for your organization. People's login IDs, passwords, and rights are stored in Active Directory, and that really controls how people work, how people compute, and what they can get to. Microsoft's created something called Azure Active Directory, which most people interact with transparently because it sits behind Office 365. It does what Active Directory does in part, but it is a different technology. You can't directly replicate data between an on-premise domain controller and Azure Active Directory. You can, however, synchronize data. Think of it as a Microsoft SQL database and an Oracle database. They can hold the same data, but they're different technologies that have different capabilities and functionality, even if they're similar. Azure Active Directory sits behind Office 365 or can be accessed on its own if you have a need for an identity management system for cloud applications. And you would use Azure AD Connect typically to do that synchronization of user IDs, metadata, and potentially password hashes. For us, this is a standard part of almost all Office 365 projects so that the data is in sync between on-premise and the cloud. That can then be used as part of the Enterprise Mobility Suite, Azure AD Premium, to allow for that to become the control plane for access to other cloud applications, whether it's Salesforce, Dropbox, Workday, Concur, WebEx, Mimecast, any applications. There are over 3,000 applications, the cloud, that have written to Microsoft's APIs for that, so that identity can be managed and controlled in one place. User comes to the business, you spin him up in one place. User leaves the business, you shut him or her down in one place. And so over time, we'll see tighter integration between on-premise and cloud Active Directory and more capabilities. For example, you can't do group policy with Azure Active Directory, but Azure AD is a critical part of Microsoft's infrastructure, and it's typically synchronized with on-premise AD in all but the smallest environments. You can also do self-service password reset if you have the Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite, which is the next slide. And this is a separate purchase. This is not part of Office 365. It's a bundle that I believe bridges the gap between Office 365 and Azure. And it consists of Microsoft Intune for mobile device and application management, Azure AD Premium, which gives you the cloud single sign-on I just talked about, as well as multi-factor authentication and self-service password reset. And it gives you a basic level of Azure Information Protection, which is the artist formerly known as Rights Management Services, so that you can set security rights on documents or emails that travel with the content. So if something leaks out of your network, you can control people's access to it and make it unavailable. There's an E5 level. Anytime you see E5 from Microsoft, it usually means extra security and extra investment on your part. And that gives you the P2 levels of AD Premium and AIP. In the case of AIP, that's data labeling and classification. So you call something, you set a stamp of top secret or confidential or sensitive, and any documents that get that stamp have those rights automatically applied. Cloud App Security, the ability to do discovery of which cloud apps are in use in your organization and whitelist or blacklist specific applications, and other security technologies. So EMS is very complementary to Office 365, and although it's not technically an Azure service, it's an important part of many organizations' security strategies. I'm going to move very quickly through this, and I thought about taking the slide out, but I figured better to spend a minute on it and give you some things to think about. So I'm going to, in 60 seconds, give you 10 steps to consider as you look at a migration to Azure. First thing is you got to understand your environment. What are the virtual machines? What's your networking infrastructure? And where should everything reside? Moving to Azure doesn't necessarily mean put everything in Azure. means determine what should be in Azure, what shouldn't, and at what speed do you go there. You then would set up the tenant in the appropriate networking, whether it's VPN or ExpressRoute. I would suggest gain experience with some low-hanging fruit scenarios, whether it's test dev or identity or backup disaster recovery, before you start migrating significant parts of your network to Azure. Azure is a consumption-based platform. You're going to be billed for what you use. The good news on that is you're not billed for what you don't use. The bad news on that is if you use a lot and you're not paying attention, you could get a very big bill at the end of the month. So put in place a mechanism and monitor for what the actual usage is over time. I would say number 5, it's important to plan security from day one. It's a lot harder to go try to bolt security on afterwards, and there's a number of tools, including the Azure Security Center from Microsoft, that'll help you with that, and we can help you with that as well, just as we can with the billing and monitoring. Make a decision on custom applications as to whether to migrate them as is, lift and shift, or whether it makes sense to transform them from an IaaS to a PaaS sort of model. Also, there's new capabilities around high availability. Like I mentioned, do you want to replicate within a data center or across data centers? And new capabilities around disaster recovery. This is an opportunity to re-envision your network. You want to establish a governance framework. One of the advantages of Azure is you can delegate to specific departments or business units the ability to create virtual machines. You may want to have chargeback for that, and you certainly want to have people that have that capability understand what their limitations are and what best practices are. Azure is also always changing, and so you need to always be learning and paying attention to new features and never be static. And Azure being something new to many organizations, it's really a great opportunity to leverage a partner like ATSG for managed services so that you can get help keeping the environment operational and focus your time and efforts on adopting change and ideally freeing up resources to drive digital transformation within your business. This sounds like a 10 steps white paper may be coming up on this topic, so keep an eye on the ATSG website over time for that possibility. So let's shift gears and talk about what is Citrix Cloud. I've been in this industry for a long time, and this is a technology that really has me jazzed and excited because I've been a big Citrix advocate for quite some time. There's a lot of changes going on with Citrix that are very exciting. For those of you that have Citrix technology, it's a great thing because you can see that change and benefit from it. And for those of you that don't, maybe it's an opportunity to reevaluate whether you should. So Citrix Cloud is really being positioned by Citrix as a integrated workspace delivery cloud. And what they mean by that is the ability to deliver a workspace based on, let's call it a Windows desktop environment, but with complementary services from a hybrid of Microsoft or third party and Citrix clouds to create scale and reduce the effort associated with having to manage that. Because let's face it, Citrix environments take a lot of work to build and they take a lot of work and effort to support. In the current environment, the current world, you have to build out an environment with products as well as cloud services unique to each customer's needs. The idea behind Citrix Cloud is that we take advantage of pre-built infrastructure, cloud services, and just customize it, similar to the discussion we just had about SaaS, and you could think of Citrix Cloud as a SaaS platform. Now you may say, well, hold on, I'm not really getting that because Citrix technology, XenApp, XenDesktop, is based on Windows computing, and that's not necessarily SaaS. The concept here is that in any Citrix environment, whether it's XenApp or XenDesktop, there's two types of infrastructure. There's the servers and desktops that do user computing, the RDS servers, the Windows virtual desktops that run Citrix agents for management and speed, enhanced performance and so on. And then there's what I'll call all the plumbing services, things like delivery controllers and licensing services and things of that nature. And one of the challenges is that as you build out different environments, public cloud platforms, private or on-premise clouds, and you have multiple locations, that plumbing needs to be created and managed in multiple places. So if you have 8 data centers, you're going to end up with 8 instances of delivery controllers and license servers and NetScalers and other things that all need to be managed. And there are some ways where you can simplify that a little bit, but by and large, that's the cost of doing business. What Citrix Cloud is about is essentially taking all those management layers and moving them out of your network into a SaaS model service run by Citrix. You're still keeping the compute workload in your environment, along with a connector server that connects essentially the bridge into Citrix Cloud. But think about it, even if you only have one data center, this gives you the ability to do disaster recovery in another data center or public cloud like Azure without having to double your Citrix infrastructure in the process. This takes a lot of the complexity that held people back from Citrix or maybe held people back from upgrading, and it essentially reduces, if not eliminates that. Because at this point, you're just a matter of configuring the Citrix infrastructure and connecting your data centers or compute platforms into it. It's really very elegant. And so it's ideal for net new environments, but also it can be, there are a lot of ways to do migration of workloads and also deal with the end of life issue for Windows Server 08 R2, which we'll talk about in a bit. Citrix has gone through a rebranding, and it's kind of funny how this has been cyclical. There was, let me see if I can get them all right. There was actually WinView in the OS2 days, then WinFrame, and then MetaFrame, and then I think there was another name, and then we came up with XenApp and XenDesktop, and now what did Citrix realize? Everyone just thinks of all this as Citrix. So we've simplified the brand. It's now Citrix Virtual Desktops, what used to be XenDesktop, Citrix Virtual Applications, what used to be XenApp. The artist formerly known as NetScaler is now Citrix Application Delivery Controller. And the bundle that takes all the end user computing stuff together is the Workplace Suite. So I like the fact that they've brought everything back to the Citrix brand and reinforced that. And you can essentially buy different combinations. So Citrix Cloud takes all the back-end services and essentially puts it into their cloud where you keep your virtual machines as servers or desktops. You're running your own Active Directory, and you're just using a cloud connector over port 443 to be the bridge back to Citrix Cloud for management, or 2 for redundancy if you choose to do so. There's a lot of economic benefits. The biggest one is just less to manage, and that's in line with the trend today of adopting the cloud to reduce the burden on IT, be faster, more nimble, upgrades are automatically built into the service, etc. So you can use that as an extension of your on-premise compute. Maybe you have a data center today with Citrix XenApp or XenDesktop, and you want to put additional capacity into Azure, as long as the compute has adequate bandwidth to the resources they're reaching for. Or you can just put stuff into Azure and run things there, or use Azure for the compute and use Citrix Cloud to reduce the management. So we talked about an extension of an existing environment, disaster recovery, and if we leverage Citrix Cloud, we're significantly reducing this eye chart of stuff that has to be managed. You can do a complete forkload lift and shift to Azure. We've done that with clients where we've essentially used Azure Site Recovery to replicate all the virtual machines into the cloud. And you can do a Citrix upgrade by just removing the old XenApp and putting on the new XenApp. So you can accomplish an upgrade that way without a huge amount of effort and get it out of premise. So Citrix and Microsoft have made a couple of recent announcements, and Citrix has always been working in lockstep with Microsoft. Microsoft's announcement, which is a little bit confusing on its own, is to deliver a platform as a service virtual desktop, which is basically a very generic Windows 10 Microsoft 365 desktop delivered basically through something like RDS. It's going to be limited in its customizability, and you will have some virtualization rights for Windows 7, even though we have an end-of-life issue coming up for 7. And this is planned for the first half of calendar 2019 or the second half of Microsoft's fiscal 19. I don't think this is going to be a great fit for a lot of folks because it's going to be very generic. Citrix is working in lockstep to release their version that's going to be more flexible and essentially allow for more customized desktop to be delivered running in Azure, but leveraging Citrix technology on top of it. And you'll be able to pay for this in a monthly subscription because Citrix's cloud solution provider program is aligned with Microsoft. And ATSG participates in both programs. So we can do your Microsoft and Citrix licensing as a monthly subscription and wrap our own managed services around it to help you manage it. So good announcements at Ignite back in September. And slowly we're working toward release of these technologies in the beginning of 2019. I mentioned the naming changes, and this slide talks a little bit about that. But again, NetScaler has become the Citrix Application Delivery Controller. NetScaler SD-WAN is Citrix SD-WAN, Citrix Workspace, Citrix Virtual App, Citrix Virtual Desktop. So Microsoft, Citrix, VMware, everybody changes the names of their products every so often, just to keep us all on our toes. And this is part of the ongoing evolution of Citrix from secure remote access to app delivery, virtual computing, mobile workspace, and now it's become more of a software-defined workspace. So a couple of points I want to end with before we open it up for questions. I mentioned subscription options. There are really three ways of consuming Azure, and in some cases Citrix. You can do a direct portal pay-as-you-go with Microsoft. Just go to azure.com and open up a subscription, get out your credit card. Typically is okay for pilots, but a lot of people don't like doing that way. The preferred method from Microsoft is through their cloud subscription provider program, where you would buy that through a partner like us. We would handle the billing and management and very often bundle that with managed services while giving you transparency into your consumption and helping you to control your costs. For larger organizations or organizations that have a predictable spend, you can do an enterprise agreement, which is sometimes the Microsoft reps call that a Starbucks card, where you essentially pre-buy a certain amount of usage. It is use it or lose it, so you better know what you're going to use it for. And it used to be that there were discounts for that upfront volume commitment, but not anymore, because Microsoft is really trying to steer people toward this CSP pay-as-you-go program and have managed service providers help customers get the most out of it. Additional considerations, you are going to be billed for consumption, so make sure you're aware of your consumption and don't get surprise bills. There is a hybrid use benefit if you have Windows Server licensing and you have software assurance, whether it's from Open, MPSA Select, or enterprise agreements. You can click a box in Azure saying, I'm bringing my own license, and drop your cost often by as much as 40% on a given virtual machine. So be conscious of that and don't double pay for your licensing. Also, if you're not aware, we have some impending end-of-life events coming up. Windows Server 2008 R2 is reaching end of life in early 2020. I believe it's January, in sync with Windows 7. SQL 08 R2, I believe, is in July of 2019. Microsoft did make an announcement a couple months ago that if you put Windows 08 R2 virtual machines, I believe this applies to SQL 08 R2 also, and there are some very narrow instances as it relates to Windows 7, Microsoft will extend support and security updates for 3 more years. So you basically get a stay of execution on that older operating system. Because when it does reach end of support, you're not getting security updates anymore, and you can't call Microsoft if there's a problem unless you're running it in Azure. So that's a low-hanging fruit situation. Set up a tenant, set up Azure Site Recovery, replicate your virtual machines into Azure, and keep them running on 08 R2 a little bit longer until you figure out what to do with them. But obviously, we don't want to just kick the can down the road. We want to have a strategy for where we're going there. So happy to talk with you about any of these items on follow-up. As far as next steps and calls to action, working with ATSG, We can have a roadmap and strategy session about your environment. If you're an enterprise agreement customer, you might have software assurance planning services vouchers that can be used for our design services at no out-of-pocket cost to you. If you're not, we can still do design services, just that Microsoft doesn't pay for them. We have quick start, basically package service engagements to help you get up and running quickly with basic configurations. Happy to talk to you about that or a custom project, and keep attending our seminars and webinars, which will be continuing to run as we go into 2019. For larger customers, there may be a possibility of Microsoft funding where there's a demonstrable return on investment to Microsoft. Let's make sure we talk about that as well where it may be pertinent. So a little bit over where I wanted to be. I said 45 minutes. 51 minutes is not too bad in that regard. I am going to open it up for questions, and if there are no questions, thank you for your time and attention, and look forward to talking about how we can help you with Azure and Citrix. Any questions? Going once. Going twice. All right, it's a wrap. Thank you all for your time, and happy holidays, and look forward to helping you in your progression to the cloud in the coming months. Have a great day, everyone.